This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. Uncle Tom's Cabin, or Life Among the Lowly, by Harriet Beecher Stowe. Volume 1, Chapter 13, The Quaker Settlement. A quiet scene now rises before us. A large, roomy, neatly painted kitchen, its yellow floor glossy and smooth, and without a particle of dust. A neat, well-blacked cooking stove, rows of shining tin, suggestive of unmentionable good things to the appetite, glossy green wood chairs, old and firm, a small flag-bottomed rocking-chair with a patchwork cushion in it, neatly contrived out of small pieces of different-colored woolen goods, and a larger-sized one, motherly and old, whose wide arms breathed hospitable invitation, seconded by the solicitation of its feather cushions, a real, comfortable, persuasive old chair, and worth, in the way of honest, homely enjoyment, a dozen of your plush or brochetelle drawing-room gentry. And in the chair, gently swaying back and forward, her eyes bent on some fine sewing, sat our fine old friend Eliza. Yes, there she is, paler and thinner than in her Kentucky home, with a world of quiet sorrow lying under the shadow of her long eyelashes, and marking the outline of her gentle mouth. It was plain to see how old and firm the girlish heart was grown under the discipline of heavy sorrow, and when anon her large dark eye was raised to follow the gambols of her little Harry, who was sporting, like some tropical butterfly, hither and thither over the floor, she showed a depth of firmness and steady resolve that was never there in her earlier and happier days. By her side sat a woman with a bright tin pan in her lap, into which she was carefully sorting some dried peaches. She might be 55 or 60, but hers was one of those faces that time seems to touch only to brighten and adorn. The snowy Lisa crape cap, made after the straight Quaker pattern, the plain white muslin handkerchief, lying in placid folds across her bosom, the drab shawl and dress, showed at once the community to which she belonged. Her face was round and rosy, with a healthful downy softness, suggestive of a ripe peach. Her hair, partially silvered by age, was parted smoothly back from a high placid forehead, on which time had written no inscription, except peace on earth, goodwill to men, and beneath shone a large pair of clear, honest, loving brown eyes. You only needed to look straight into them to feel that you saw to the bottom of a heart as good and true as ever throbbed in woman's bosom. So much has been said and sung of beautiful young girls, why don't somebody wake up to the beauty of old women? If any want to get up an inspiration under this head, we refer them to our good friend Rachel Halliday, just as she sits there in her little rocking-chair. It had a turn for quacking and squeaking, that chair had, either from having taken cold in early life, or from some asthmatic affection, or perhaps from nervous derangement. But, as she gently swung backward and forward, the chair kept up a kind of subdued creechy-crotchy that would have been intolerable in any other chair. But old Simeon Halliday often declared it was as good as any music to him, and the children all avowed that they wouldn't miss of hearing mother's chair for anything in the world. For why? For 20 years or more nothing but loving words and gentle moralities and motherly loving kindness had come from that chair. Headaches and heartaches innumerable had been cured there, difficulties spiritual and temporal solved there, all by one good, loving woman, God bless her. "And so thee still thinks of going to Canada, Eliza?" she said, as she was quietly looking over her peaches. "Yes, ma'am," said Eliza firmly. "I must go onward, I dare not stop." "And what'll thee do when thee gets there? Thee must think about that, my daughter." "My daughter" came naturally from the lips of Rachel Halliday, for hers was just the face and form that made mother seem the most natural word in the world. Eliza's hands trembled, and some tears fell on her fine work, which she answered firmly. "I shall do anything I can find. I hope I can find something." "Thee knows thee can stay here as long as thee pleases," said Rachel.
"Oh, thank you," said Eliza. "But," she pointed to Harry, "I can't sleep nights. I can't rest. Last night I dreamed I saw that man coming into the yard," she said, shuddering. "Poor child," said Rachel, wiping her eyes. "But thee mustn't feel so. The Lord hath ordered it so that never hath a fugitive been stolen from our village. I trust thine will not be the first."
The door here opened, and a little short, round, pin-cushiony woman stood at the door, with a cheery, blooming face like a ripe apple. She was dressed, like Rachel, in a sober gray, with a muslin folded neatly across her round, plump little chest.
"Ruth Stedman," said Rachel, coming joyfully forward. "How is thee, Ruth?" she said, heartily, taking both her hands.
"Nicely," said Ruth, taking off her little drab bonnet and dusting it with her handkerchief, displaying, as she did so, a round little head on which the Quaker cap sat with a sort of jaunty air, despite all the stroking and patting of the small fat hands which were busily applied to arranging it. Certain stray locks of decidedly curly hair, too, had escaped here and there, and had to be coaxed and cajoled into their place again; and then the new owner, who might have been 25, turned from the small looking-glass, before which she had been making these arrangements, and looked well pleased, as most people who looked at her might have been, for she was decidedly a wholesome, whole-hearted, chirruping little woman, as ever gladdened a man's heart withal.
"Ruth, this friend is Eliza Harris, and this is the little boy I told thee of." "I am glad to see thee, Eliza, very,"
said Ruth, shaking hands, as if Eliza were an old friend she had long been expecting.
"And this is thy dear boy. I brought a cake for him,"
she said, holding out a little heart to the boy, who came up, gazing through his curls, and accepted it shyly.
"Where's thy baby, Ruth?" said Rachel. "Oh, he's coming. But thy Mary caught him as I came in, and ran off with him to the barn, to show him to the children."
At this moment the door opened, and Mary, an honest, rosy-looking girl, with large brown eyes like her mother's, came in with the baby.
"Aha!" said Rachel, coming up, and taking the great white fat fellow in her arms. "How good he looks, and how he does grow!" "To be sure he does," said little bustling Ruth, as she took the child, and began taking off a little blue silk hood, and various layers and wrappers of outer garments; and having given a twitch here and a pull there, and variously adjusted and arranged him, and kissed him heartily, she set him on the floor to collect his thoughts. Baby seemed quite used to this mode of proceeding, for he put his thumb in his mouth, as if it were quite a thing, of course, and seemed soon absorbed in his own reflections, while the mother seated herself, and taking out a long stocking of mixed blue and white yarn, began to knit with briskness. "Mary, thee'd better fill the kettle, hadn't thee?" gently suggested the mother.
Mary took the kettle to the well, and soon reappearing, placed it over the stove, where it was soon purring and steaming, a sort of centre of hospitality and good cheer. The peaches, moreover, in obedience to a few gentle whispers from Rachel, were soon deposited, by the same hand, in a stew-pan over the fire. Rachel now took down a snowy moulding board, and, tying on an apron, proceeded quietly to making up some biscuits, first saying to Mary, "Mary, hadn't thee better tell John to get a chicken ready?" And Mary disappeared accordingly. "And how is Abigail Peters?" said Rachel, as she went on with her biscuits. "Oh, she's better," said Ruth.
"I was in this morning, made the bed, tidied up the house. Leah Hills went in this afternoon, and baked bread and pies enough to last some days, and I engaged to go back to get her up this evening. I will go in to-morrow, and do any cleaning there may be, and
look over the mending," said Rachel.
"Ah, that is well," said Ruth. "I've heard," she added, "that Hannah Stanwood is sick. John was up there last night. I must go there to-morrow." "John can come in here to his meals if thee needs to stay all day," suggested Rachel. "Thank thee, Rachel. We'll see, to-morrow. But here comes Simeon."
Simeon Halliday, a tall, straight, muscular man, in drab coat and pantaloons and broad-brimmed hat, now entered. "How is thee, Ruth?" he said warmly, as he spread his broad, open hand for her little fat palm. "And how is John?"
"Oh, John is well, and all the rest of our folks," said Ruth cheerily. "Any news, father?" said Rachel, as she was putting her biscuits into the oven. "Peter Stebbins told me that they should be along tonight, with friends," said Simeon, significantly, as he was washing his hands at a neat sink in a little back porch. "Indeed," said Rachel, looking thoughtfully and glancing at Eliza. "Did thee say thy name was Harris?" said Simeon to Eliza, as he re-entered. Rachel glanced quickly at her husband, as Eliza tremulously answered, "Yes," her fears, ever uppermost, suggesting that possibly there might be advertisements out for her. "Mother," said Simeon, standing in the porch, and calling Rachel out. "What does thee want, father?" said Rachel, rubbing her floury hands as she went into the porch. "This child's husband is in the settlement, and will be here tonight," said Simeon. "Now, thee doesn't know that, father?" said Rachel, all her face radiant with joy. "It's really true. Peter was down yesterday, with the wagon, to the other stand, and there he found an old woman and two men, and one said his name was George Harris, and from what he told of his history, I am certain who he is. He is a bright, likely fellow, too." "Shall we tell her now?" said Simeon. "Let's tell Ruth," said Rachel. "Here, Ruth, come here." Ruth laid down her knitting work, and was in the back porch in a moment. "Ruth, what does thee think?" said Rachel. "Father says Eliza's husband is in the last company, and will be here tonight." A burst of joy from the little Quakeress interrupted the speech. She gave such a bound from the floor as she clapped her little hands that two stray curls fell from under her Quaker cap and lay brightly on her white neckerchief. "Hush thee, dear," said Rachel gently. "Hush, Ruth. Tell us. Shall we tell her now?" "Now, to be sure, this very minute. Why, now, suppose 'twas my John, how should I feel? Do tell her, right off." "Thee uses thyself only to learn how to love thy neighbor, Ruth," said Simeon, looking with a beaming face on Ruth. "To be sure. Isn't it what we are made for? If I didn't love John and the baby, I should not know how to feel for her. Come, now, do tell her, do." And she laid her hands persuasively on Rachel's arm. "Take her into thy bedroom there, and let me fry the chicken while thee does it." Rachel came out into the kitchen, where Eliza was sewing, and opening the door of a small bedroom, said gently, "Come in here with me, my daughter. I have news to tell thee." The blood flushed in Eliza's pale face. She rose, trembling with nervous anxiety, and looked towards her boy. "No, no," said little Ruth, darting up and seizing her hands. "Never thee fear. It's good news, Eliza. Go in, go in." And she gently pushed her to the door, which closed after her; and then, turning round, she caught little Harry in her arms, and began kissing him. "Thee'll see thy father, little one. Does thee know it? Thy father is coming," she said over and over again, as the boy looked wonderingly at her. Meanwhile, within the door another scene was going on. Rachel Halliday drew Eliza toward her, and said, "The Lord hath had mercy on thee, daughter. Thy husband hath escaped from the house of bondage." The blood flushed to Eliza's cheek in a sudden glow, and went back to her heart with as sudden a rush. She sat down pale and faint. "Have courage, child," said Rachel, laying her hand on her head. "He is among friends, who will bring him here tonight." "Tonight!" Eliza repeated. "Tonight!" The words lost all meaning to her. Her head was dreamy and confused. All was mist for a moment. When she awoke she found herself snugly tucked up on the bed, with a blanket over her, and little Ruth rubbing her hands with camphor. She opened her eyes in a state of dreamy, delicious languor, such as one who has long been bearing a heavy load, and now feels it gone, and would rest. The tension of the nerves, which had never ceased a moment since the first hour of her flight, had given way, and a strange feeling of security and rest came over her. And as she lay, with her large dark eyes open, she followed, as in a quiet dream, the motions of those about her. She saw the door open into the other room, saw the supper table, with its snowy cloth, heard the dreamy murmur of the singing tea-kettle, saw Ruth tripping backward and forward, with plates of cake and saucers of preserves, and ever and anon stopping to put a cake into Harry's hand, or pat his head, or twine his long curls round her snowy fingers. She saw the ample, motherly form of Rachel, as she ever and anon came to the bedside, and smoothed and arranged something about the bedclothes, and gave a tuck here and there by way of expressing her good will, and was conscious of a kind of sunshine beaming down upon her from her large, clear brown eyes. She saw Ruth's husband come in, saw her fly up to him, and commence whispering very earnestly, ever and anon with impressive gesture, pointing her little finger toward the room. She saw her, with the baby in her arms, sitting down to tea. She saw them all at table, and little Harry in a high chair, under the shadow of Rachel's ample wing. There were low murmurs of talk, gentle tinkling of teaspoons, and musical clatter of cups and saucers, and all mingled in a delightful dream of rest, and Eliza slept as she had not slept before, since the fearful midnight hour when she had taken her child and fled through the frosty starlight. She dreamed of a beautiful country, a land, it seemed to her, of rest, green shores, pleasant islands, and beautifully glittering water. And there, in a house which kind voices told her was a home, she saw her boy playing, free and happy child. She heard her husband's footsteps. She felt him coming nearer. His arms were around her, his tears falling on her face, and she awoke. It was no dream. The daylight had long faded. Her child lay calmly sleeping by her side, a candle was burning dimly on the stand, and her husband was sobbing by her pillow. The next morning was a cheerful one at the Quaker house. Mother was up betimes, and surrounded by busy girls and boys whom we had scarce time to introduce to our readers yesterday, and who all moved obediently to Rachel's gentle "Thee had better," or more gentle "Hadn't thee better?" in the work of getting breakfast. For a breakfast in the luxurious valleys of Indiana is a thing complicated and multiform, and, like picking up the rose leaves and trimming the bushes in paradise, asking other hands than those of the original mother. While, therefore, John ran to the spring for fresh water, and Simeon the second sifted meal for corn cakes, and Mary ground coffee, Rachel moved gently and quietly about, making biscuits, cutting up chicken, and diffusing a sort of sunny radiance over the whole proceeding generally. If there was any danger of friction or collision from the ill-regulated zeal of so many young operators, her gentle "Come, come," or "I wouldn't now," was quite sufficient to allay the difficulty. Bards have written of the cestus of Venus that turned the heads of all the world in successive generations. We had rather, for our part, have the cestus of Rachel Halliday, that kept heads from being turned, and made everything go on harmoniously. We think it is more suited to our modern days, decidedly. While all other preparations were going on, Simeon the elder stood in his shirt-sleeves before a little looking-glass in the corner, engaged in the anti-patriarchal operation of shaving. Everything went on so sociably, so quietly, so harmoniously in the great kitchen. It seemed so pleasant to every one to do just what they were doing. There was such an atmosphere of mutual confidence and good fellowship everywhere. Even the knives and forks had a social clatter as they went on to the table, and the chicken and ham had a cheerful and joyous fizzle in the pan, as if they rather enjoyed being cooked than otherwise. And when George and Eliza and little Harry came out, they met such a hearty, rejoicing welcome, no wonder it seemed to them like a dream. At last they were all seated at breakfast, while Mary stood at the stove, baking griddle cakes, which, as they gained the true exact golden brown tint of perfection, were transferred quite handily to the table. Rachel never looked so truly and benignly happy as at the head of her table. There was so much motherliness and full-heartedness even in the way she passed a plate of cakes or poured a cup of coffee, that it seemed to put a spirit into the food and drink she offered. It was the first time that ever George had sat down on equal terms at any white man's table, and he sat down at first with some constraint and awkwardness, but they all exhaled and went off like fog in the genial morning rays of this simple, overflowing kindness. This indeed was a home. Home, a word that George had never yet known a meaning for, and a belief in God and trust in His providence began to encircle his heart, as with a golden cloud of protection and confidence, dark, misanthropic, pining atheistic doubts and fierce despair melted away before the light of a living gospel, breathed in living faces, preached by 1,000 unconscious acts of love and goodwill, which, like the cup of cold water given in the name of a disciple, shall never lose their reward. "Father, what if thee should get found out again?" said Simeon second, as he buttered his cake.
"I should pay my fine," said Simeon gently.
"But what if they put thee in prison?"
"Couldn't thee and mother manage the farm?" said Simeon, smiling.
"Mother can do almost everything," said the boy. "But isn't it a shame to make such laws?"
"Thee mustn't speak evil of thy rulers, Simeon," said his father gravely. "The Lord only gives us our worldly goods that we may do justice and mercy. If our rulers require a price of us for it, we must deliver it up."
"Well, I hate those old slaveholders,"
said the boy, who felt as unchristian as became any modern reformer. "I am surprised at thee, son," said Simeon. "Thy mother never taught thee so. I would do even the same for the slaveholder as for the slave, if the Lord brought him to my door in affliction." Simeon's second blushed scarlet, but his mother only smiled, and said,
"Simeon is my good boy. He will grow older by and by, and then he will be like his father."
"I hope, my good sir, that you are not exposed to any difficulty on our account," said George anxiously. "Fear nothing, George, for therefore are we sent into the world. If we would not meet trouble for a good cause, we were not worthy of our name." "But for me," said George, "I could not bear it." "Fear not, then, friend George, it is not for thee, but for God and man we do it," said Simeon. "And now thou must lie quietly this day, and to-night at 10 o'clock Phineas Fletcher will carry thee onward to the next stand, thee and the rest of thy company. The pursuers are hard after thee. We must not delay." "If that is the case, why wait till evening?" said George. "Thou art safe here by daylight, for every one in the settlement is a friend, and all are watching. It has been found safer to travel by night." Chapter 14. Evangeline. A young star, which shone o'er life too sweet an image for such glass, a lovely being, scarcely formed or moulded, a rose with all its sweetest leaves yet folded. The Mississippi. How, as by an enchanted wand, have its scenes been changed since Chateaubriand wrote his prose poetic description of it. Note: in Atala, or The Love and Constancy of Two Savages in the Desert, 1801, by François Auguste René, Vicomte de Chateaubriand, 1768 1848. As a river of mighty, unbroken solitudes, rolling amid undreamed wonders of vegetable and animal existence. But as in an hour this river of dreams and wild romance has emerged to a reality scarcely less visionary and splendid, what other river of the world bears on its bosom to the ocean the wealth and enterprise of such another country, a country whose products embrace all between the tropics and the poles? Those turbid waters, hurrying, foaming, tearing along, an apt resemblance of that headlong tide of business which is poured along its wave by a race more vehement and energetic than any the old world ever saw. Ah, would that they did not also bear along a more fearful freight, the tears of the oppressed, the sighs of the helpless, the bitter prayers of poor ignorant hearts to an unknown God, unknown, unseen, and silent, but who will yet come out of his place and save all the poor of the earth. The slanting light of the setting sun quivers on the sea-like expanse of the river. The shivery canes and the tall dark cypress, hung with wreaths of dark funereal moss, glow in the golden ray as the heavily laden steamboat marches onward. Piled with cotton bales from many a plantation, up over deck and sides, till she seems in the distance a square massive block of gray, she moves heavily onward to the nearing mart. We must look some time among its crowded decks before we shall find again our humble friend Tom. High on the upper deck, in a little nook among the everywhere predominant cotton bales, at last we may find him. Partly from confidence inspired by Mr. Shelby's representations, and partly from the remarkably inoffensive and quiet character of the man, Tom had insensibly won his way far into the confidence even of such a man as Haley. At first he had watched him narrowly through the day, and never allowed him to sleep at night unfettered, but the uncomplaining patience and apparent contentment of Tom's manner led him gradually to discontinue these restraints,
and for some time Tom had enjoyed a sort of parole of honor, being permitted to come and go freely where he pleased on the boat. Ever quiet and obliging, and more than ready to lend a hand in every emergency which occurred among the workmen below, he had won the good opinion of all the hands, and spent many hours in helping them with as hearty a good will as ever he worked on a Kentucky farm. When there seemed to be nothing for him to do, he would climb to a nook among the cotton bales of the upper deck, and busy himself in studying over his Bible, and it is there we see him now. For 100 or more miles above New Orleans, the river is higher than the surrounding country, and rolls its tremendous volume between massive levees 20 feet in height. The traveler from the deck of the steamer, as from some floating castle-top, overlooks the whole country for miles and miles around. Tom, therefore, had spread out full before him, in plantation after plantation, a map of the life to which he was approaching. He saw the distant slaves at their toil. He saw afar their villages of huts gleaming out in long rows on many a plantation, distant from the stately mansions and pleasure grounds of the master. And as the moving picture passed on, his poor foolish heart would be turning backward to the Kentucky farm, with its old shadowy beeches, to the master's house, with its wide cool halls, and near by the little cabin overgrown with the multiflora and bignonia. There he seemed to see familiar faces of comrades who had grown up with him from infancy. He saw his busy wife bustling in her preparations for his evening meals. He heard the merry laugh of his boys at their play, and the chirrup of the baby at his knee. And then, with a start, all faded, and he saw again the canebrakes and cypresses and gliding plantations, and heard again the creaking and groaning of the machinery, all telling him too plainly that all that phase of life had gone by forever. In such a case, you write to your wife and send messages to your children. But Tom could not write. The mail for him had no existence, and the gulf of separation was unbridged by even a friendly word or signal. Is it strange, then, that some tears fall on the pages of his Bible as he lays it on the cotton bale, and, with patient finger, threading his slow way from word to word, traces out its promises? Having learned late in life, Tom was but a slow reader, and passed on laboriously from verse to verse. Fortunate for him was it that the book he was intent on was one which slow reading cannot injure; nay, one whose words, like ingots of gold, seem often to need to be weighed separately, that the mind may take in their priceless value. Let us follow him a moment, as, pointing to each word and pronouncing each half aloud, he reads: "Let not your heart be troubled. In my Father's house are many mansions. I go to prepare a place for you." Cicero, when he buried his darling and only daughter, had a heart as full of honest grief as poor Tom's, perhaps no fuller, for both were only men. But Cicero could pause over no such sublime words of hope, and look to no such future reunion, and if he had seen them, 10 to 1 he would not have believed. He must fill his head first with 1,000 questions of authenticity of manuscript and correctness of translation. But to poor Tom, there it lay, just what he needed, so evidently true and divine that the possibility of a question never entered his simple head. It must be true, for, if not true, how could he live? As for Tom's Bible, though it had no annotations and helps in margin from learned commentators, still it had been embellished with certain waymarks and guide-boards of Tom's own invention, and which helped him more than the most learned expositions could have done. It had been his custom to get the Bible read to him by his master's children, in particular by young Master George, and as they read he would designate, by bold, strong marks and dashes, with pen and ink, the passages which more particularly gratified his ear or affected his heart. His Bible was thus marked through, from one end to the other, with a variety of styles and designations, so he could in a moment seize upon his favorite passages, without the labor of spelling out what lay between them,
and while it lay there before him, every passage breathing of some old home scene, and recalling some past enjoyment, his Bible seemed to him all of this life that remained, as well as the promise of a future one. Among the passengers on the boat was a young gentleman of fortune and family, resident in New Orleans, who bore the name of St. Clair. He had with him a daughter between 5 and 6 years of age, together with a lady who seemed to claim relationship to both, and to have the little one especially under her charge. Tom had often caught glimpses of this little girl, for she was one of those busy, tripping creatures that can be no more contained in one place than a sunbeam or a summer breeze. Nor was she one that, once seen, could be easily forgotten. Her form was the perfection of childish beauty, without its usual chubbiness and squareness of outline. There was about it an undulating and aerial grace, such as one might dream of for some mythic and allegorical being. Her face was remarkable less for its perfect beauty of feature than for a singular and dreamy earnestness of expression, which made the ideal start when they looked at her, and by which the dullest and most literal were impressed, without exactly knowing why. The shape of her head, and the turn of her neck and bust, was peculiarly noble, and the long golden-brown hair that floated like a cloud around it, the deep spiritual gravity of her violet-blue eyes, shaded by heavy fringes of golden-brown, all marked her out from other children, and made every one turn and look after her as she glided hither and thither on the boat. Nevertheless, the little one was not what you would have called either a grave child or a sad one. On the contrary, an airy and innocent playfulness seemed to flicker like the shadow of summer leaves over her childish face and around her buoyant figure. She was always in motion, always with a half-smile on her rosy mouth, flying hither and thither with an undulating and cloud-like tread, singing to herself as she moved as in a happy dream. Her father and female guardian were incessantly busy in the pursuit of her, but, when caught, she melted from them again like a summer cloud, and as no word of chiding or reproof ever fell on her ear for whatever she chose to do, she pursued her own way all over the boat. Always dressed in white, she seemed to move like a shadow through all sorts of places, without contracting spot or stain, and there was not a corner or nook above or below where those fairy footsteps had not glided, and that visionary golden head with its deep blue eyes fleeted along. The fireman, as he looked up from his sweaty toil, sometimes found those eyes looking wonderingly into the raging depths of the furnace, and fearfully and pityingly at him, as if she thought him in some dreadful danger. Anon the steersman at the wheel paused and smiled, as the picture-like head gleamed through the window of the roundhouse, and in a moment was gone again. 1,000 times a day rough voices blessed her, and smiles of unwonted softness stole over hard faces as she passed, and when she tripped fearlessly over dangerous places, rough, sooty hands were stretched involuntarily out to save her and smooth her path. Tom, who had the soft, impressible nature of his kindly race, ever yearning toward the simple and childlike, watched the little creature with daily increasing interest. To him she seemed something almost divine, and whenever her golden head and deep blue eyes peered out upon him from behind some dusky cotton bale, or looked down upon him over some ridge of packages, he half believed that he saw one of the angels stepped out of his New Testament. Often and often she walked mournfully round the place where Haley's gang of men and women sat in their chains. She would glide in among them and look at them with an air of perplexed and sorrowful earnestness, and sometimes she would lift their chains with her slender hands, and then sigh woefully as she glided away. Several times she appeared suddenly among them, with her hands full of candy, nuts, and oranges, which she would distribute joyfully to them, and then be gone again. Tom watched the little lady a great deal before he ventured on any overtures towards acquaintanceship. He knew an abundance of simple acts to propitiate and invite the approaches of the little people, and he resolved to play his part right skillfully. He could cut cunning little baskets out of cherry stones, could make grotesque faces on hickory nuts, or odd jumping figures out of elder pith, and he was a very Pan in the manufacture of whistles of all sizes and sorts. His pockets were full of miscellaneous articles of attraction, which he had hoarded in days of old for his master's children, and which he now produced with commendable prudence and economy, one by one, as overtures for acquaintance and friendship. The little one was shy, for all her busy interest in everything going on, and it was not easy to tame her. For a while she would perch like a canary bird on some box or package near Tom, while busy in the little arts aforenamed, and take from him, with a kind of grave bashfulness, the little articles he offered. But at last they got on quite confidential terms. "What's little missy's name?" said Tom, at last, when he thought matters were ripe to push such an inquiry.
"Evangeline St. Clair," said the little one, "though Papa and everybody else call me Eva. Now what's your name?"
"My name's Tom. The little children used to call me Uncle Tom, way back thar in Kentuck."
"Then I mean to call you Uncle Tom, because you see I like you," said Eva. "So, Uncle Tom, where are you going?"
"I don't know, Miss Eva."
"Don't know?" said Eva.
"No. I am going to be sold to somebody, I don't know who."
"My papa can buy you," said Eva quickly, "and if he buys you, you will have good times. I mean to ask him this very day."
"Thank you, my little lady," said Tom. The boat here stopped at a small landing to take in wood, and Eva, hearing her father's voice, bounded nimbly away. Tom rose up and went forward to offer his service in wooding, and soon was busy among the hands. Eva and her father were standing together by the railings to see the boat start from the landing-place. The wheel had made 2 or 3 revolutions in the water when, by some sudden movement, the little one suddenly lost her balance and fell sheer over the side of the boat into the water. Her father, scarce knowing what he did, was plunging in after her, but was held back by some behind him, who saw that more efficient aid had followed his child. Tom was standing just under her on the lower deck as she fell. He saw her strike the water and sink, and was after her in a moment. A broad-chested, strong-armed fellow, it was nothing for him to keep afloat in the water till, in a moment or two, the child rose to the surface, and he caught her in his arms, and, swimming with her to the boat's side, handed her up, all dripping, to the grasp of hundreds of hands, which, as if they had all belonged to one man, were stretched eagerly out to receive her. A few moments more, and her father bore her, dripping and senseless, to the ladies' cabin, where, as is usual in cases of the kind, there ensued a very well-meaning and kind-hearted strife among the female occupants generally, as to who should do the most things to make a disturbance, and to hinder her recovery in every way possible. It was a sultry, close day, the next day, as the steamer drew near to New Orleans. A general bustle of expectation and preparation was spread through the boat. In the cabin, one and another were gathering their things together and arranging them, preparatory to going ashore. The steward and chambermaid and all were busily engaged in cleaning, furbishing, and arranging the splendid boat, preparatory to a grand entree. On the lower deck sat our friend Tom, with his arms folded, and anxiously, from time to time, turning his eyes towards a group on the other side of the boat. There stood the fair Evangeline, a little paler than the day before, but otherwise exhibiting no traces of the accident which had befallen her. A graceful, elegantly formed young man stood by her, carelessly leaning one elbow on a bale of cotton, while a large pocket-book lay open before him. It was quite evident, at a glance, that the gentleman was Eva's father. There was the same noble cast of head, the same large blue eyes, the same golden-brown hair, yet the expression was wholly different. In the large, clear blue eyes, though in form and color exactly similar, there was wanting that misty, dreamy depth of expression. All was clear, bold, and bright, but with a light wholly of this world. The beautifully cut mouth had a proud and somewhat sarcastic expression, while an air of free and easy superiority sat not ungracefully in every turn and movement of his fine form. He was listening, with a good-humored, negligent air, half comic, half contemptuous, to Haley, who was very volubly expatiating on the quality of the article for which they were bargaining. "All the moral and Christian virtues bound in black morocco complete," he said, when Haley had finished. "Well, now, my good fellow, what's the damage, as they say in Kentucky? In short, what's to be paid out for this business? How much are you going to cheat me now? Out with it."
"Well," said Haley, "if I should say $1,300 for that, our fellow, I shouldn't but just save myself. I shouldn't now, really." "Poor fellow," said the young man, fixing his keen, mocking blue eye on him. "But I suppose you'd let me have him for that, out of a particular regard for me." "Well, the young lady here seems to be sot on him, and naturally enough."
"Oh, certainly, there's a call on your benevolence, my friend. Now, as a matter of Christian charity, how cheap could you afford to let him go to oblige a young lady that's particularly sot on him?"
"Well, now, just think on it," said the trader. "Just look on them limbs, broad-chested, strong as a horse. Look at his head. Them high foreheads of lays shows calculating niggers. They'll do any kind of thing. I've marked that ar. Now, a nigger of that ar heft and build is worth considerable, just as you may say, for his body, supposing he's stupid, but come to put in his calculating faculties, and them which I can show he has uncommon, why, of course it makes him come higher. Why, that our fellow managed his master's whole farm. He has a 'strornary talent for business."
"Bad, bad, very bad, knows altogether too much," said the young man, with the same mocking smile playing about his mouth. "Never will do in the world. Your smart fellows are always running off, stealing horses, and raising the devil generally. I think he'll have to take off a couple of hundred for his smartness."
"Well, there might be something in that ar, if it weren't for his character. But I can show recommends from his master and others to prove he is one of your real pious, the most humble, praying, pious critter you ever did see. Why, he's been called a preacher in them parts he came from."
"And I must use him for a family chaplain, possibly," added the young man dryly. "That's quite an idea. Religion is a remarkably scarce article at our house."
"You're joking now."
"How do you know I am? Didn't you just warrant him for a preacher? Has he been examined by any synod or council? Come, hand over your papers." If the trader had not been sure, by a certain good-humored twinkle in the large eye, that all this banter was sure, in the long run, to turn out a cash concern, he might have been somewhat out of patience. As it was, he laid down a greasy pocket-book on the cotton bales, and began anxiously studying over certain papers in it, the young man standing by, the while, looking down on him with an air of careless, easy drollery. "Papa, do buy him. It's no matter what you pay," whispered Eva softly, getting up on a package, and putting her arm around her father's neck. "You have money enough, I know. I want him." "What for, pussy? Are you going to use him for a rattle-box or a rocking-horse, or what?" "I want to make him happy." "An original reason, certainly." Here the trader handed up a certificate signed by Mr. Shelby, which the young man took with the tips of his long fingers and glanced over carelessly. "A gentlemanly hand," he said, "and well spelt, too. Well, now, I'm not sure, after all, about this religion," said he, the old wicked expression returning to his eye. "The country is almost ruined with pious white people, and such pious politicians as we have just before elections, such pious goings-on in all departments of church and state, that a fellow does not know who'll cheat him next. I don't know, either, about religions being up in the market just now. I have not looked in the papers lately to see how it sells. How many $100, now, do you put on for this religion?"
"You like to be joking now," said the trader. "But then there's sense under all that ar. I know there's differences in religion. Some kinds is miserable. There's your meetin' pious. There's your singin', roarin' pious. Them ain't no account in black or white. But these raily is. And I've seen it in niggers as often as any, your rail, softly, quiet, stiddy, honest pious, that the hull world couldn't tempt 'em to do nothing that they think's wrong. And you see in this letter what Tom's old master says about him."
"Now," said the young man, stooping gravely over his book of bills, "if you can assure me that I really can buy this kind of pious, and that it will be set down to my account in the book up above, as something belonging to me, I wouldn't care if I did go a little extra for it. How'd you say?"
"Well, rally, I can't do that," said the trader. "I'm a thinking that every man'll have to hang on his own hook in them ar quarters."
"Rather hard on a fellow that pays extra on religion, and can't trade with it in the state where he wants it most, ain't it now?" said the young man, who had been making out a roll of bills while he was speaking.
There, count your money, old boy," he added as he handed the roll to the trader.
"All right,"
Said Haley, his face beaming with delight, and pulling out an old inkhorn he proceeded to fill out a bill of sale, which in a few moments he handed to the young man. "I wonder, now, if I was divided up and inventoried," said the latter, as he ran over the paper, "how much I might bring. Say, so much for the shape of my head, so much for a high forehead, so much for arms and hands and legs, and then so much for education, learning, talent, honesty, religion. Bless me, there would be small charge on that last, I'm thinking. But come, Eva," he said, and taking the hand of his daughter, he stepped across the boat, and carelessly putting the tip of his finger under Tom's chin, said good-humoredly, "Look up, Tom, and see how you like your new master." Tom looked up. It was not in nature to look into that gay, young, handsome face without a feeling of pleasure, and Tom felt the tears start in his eyes as he said heartily,
"God bless you, massa."
"Well, I hope he will. What's your name? Tom? Quite as likely to do for your asking as mine, from all accounts. Can you drive horses, Tom?"
"I've been always used to horses," said Tom.
"Massa Shelby raised heaps of 'em. Well, I think I shall put you in a coachee, on condition that you won't be drunk more than once a week, unless in cases of emergency, Tom." Tom looked surprised and rather hurt, and said,
"I never drink, massa."
"I've heard that story before, Tom. But then we'll see. It will be a special accommodation to all concerned if you don't. Never mind, my boy," he added good-humoredly, seeing Tom still looked grave, "I don't doubt you mean to do well."
"I certain do, massa," said Tom.
"And you shall have good times," said Eva. "Papa is very good to everybody, only he always will laugh at them."
"Papa is much obliged to you for his recommendation," said St. Clair, laughing, as he turned on his heel and walked away. Chapter 15. Of Tom's New Master, and various other matters. Since the thread of our humble hero's life has now become interwoven with that of higher ones, it is necessary to give some brief introduction to them. Augustine St. Clair was the son of a wealthy planter of Louisiana. The family had its origin in Canada. Of two brothers, very similar in temperament and character, one had settled on a flourishing farm in Vermont, and the other became an opulent planter in Louisiana. The mother of Augustine was a Huguenot French lady, whose family had emigrated to Louisiana during the days of its early settlement. Augustine and another brother were the only children of their parents. Having inherited from his mother an exceeding delicacy of constitution, he was, at the instance of physicians, during many years of his boyhood, sent to the care of his uncle in Vermont, in order that his constitution might be strengthened by the cold of a more bracing climate. In childhood he was remarkable for an extreme and marked sensitiveness of character, more akin to the softness of woman than the ordinary hardness of his own sex. Time, however, overgrew this softness with the rough bark of manhood, and but few knew how living and fresh it still lay at the core. His talents were of the very first order, although his mind showed a preference always for the ideal and the aesthetic, and there was about him that repugnance to the actual business of life which is the common result of this balance of the faculties. Soon after the completion of his college course, his whole nature was kindled into one intense and passionate effervescence of romantic passion. His hour came, the hour that comes only once. His star rose in the horizon. That star rises so often in vain, to be remembered only as a thing of dreams, and it rose for him in vain. To drop the figure, he saw and won the love of a high-minded and beautiful woman in one of the northern states, and they were affianced. He returned south to make arrangements for their marriage, when, most unexpectedly, his letters were returned to him by mail, with a short note from her guardian, stating to him that ere this reached him the lady would be the wife of another. Stung to madness, he vainly hoped, as many another has done, to fling the whole thing from his heart by one desperate effort. Too proud to supplicate or seek explanation, he threw himself at once into a whirl of fashionable society, and in a fortnight from the time of the fatal letter was the accepted lover of the reigning belle of the season. And as soon as arrangements could be made, he became the husband of a fine figure, a pair of bright dark eyes, and $100,000, and of course everybody thought him a happy fellow. The married couple were enjoying their honeymoon, and entertaining a brilliant circle of friends in their splendid villa near Lake Pontchartrain, when one day a letter was brought to him in that well-remembered writing. It was handed to him while he was in full tide of gay and successful conversation in a whole roomful of company. He turned deadly pale when he saw the writing, but still preserved his composure, and finished the playful warfare of badinage which he was at the moment carrying on with a lady opposite, and a short time after was missed from the circle. In his room, alone, he opened and read the letter, now worse than idle and useless to be read. It was from her, giving a long account of a persecution to which she had been exposed by her guardian's family, to lead her to unite herself with their son; and she related how, for a long time, his letters had ceased to arrive, how she had written time and again till she became weary and doubtful, how her health had failed under her anxieties, and how at last she had discovered the whole fraud which had been practiced on them both. The letter ended with expressions of hope and thankfulness, and professions of undying affection, which were more bitter than death to the unhappy young man. He wrote to her immediately: "I have received yours, but too late. I believed all I heard. I was desperate. I am married, and all is over. Only forget. It is all that remains for either of us." And thus ended the whole romance and ideal of life for Augustine St. Clair. But the real remained, the real, like the flat, bare, oozy tide mud, when the blue sparkling wave, with all its company of gliding boats and white-winged ships, its music of oars and chiming waters, has gone down, and there it lies, flat, slimy, bare, exceedingly real. Of course, in a novel, people's hearts break, and they die, and that is the end of it. And in a story this is very convenient. But in real life we do not die when all that makes life bright dies to us. There is a most busy and important round of eating, drinking, dressing, walking, visiting, buying, selling, talking, reading, and all that makes up what is commonly called living, yet to be gone through. And this yet remained to Augustine. Had his wife been a whole woman, she might yet have done something, as woman can, to mend the broken threads of life, and weave again into a tissue of brightness. But Marie St. Clair could not even see that they had been broken. As before stated, she consisted of a fine figure, a pair of splendid eyes, and $100,000, and none of these items were precisely the ones to minister to a mind diseased. When Augustine, pale as death, was found lying on the sofa, and pleaded sudden sick headache as the cause of his distress, she recommended to him to smell of hartshorn; and when the paleness and headache came on week after week, she only said that she never thought Mr. St. Clair was sickly, but it seems he was very liable to sick headaches, and that it was a very unfortunate thing for her, because he didn't enjoy going into company with her, and it seemed odd to go so much alone, when they were just married. Augustine was glad in his heart that he had married so undiscerning a woman, but as the glosses and civilities of the honeymoon wore away, he discovered that a beautiful young woman, who has lived all her life to be caressed and waited on, might prove quite a hard mistress in domestic life. Marie never had possessed much capability of affection, or much sensibility, and the little that she had been merged into a most intense and unconscious selfishness, a selfishness the more hopeless from its quiet obtuseness, its utter ignorance of any claims but her own. From her infancy she had been surrounded with servants who lived only to study her caprices. The idea that they had either feelings or rights had never dawned upon her, even in distant perspective. Her father, whose only child she had been, had never denied her anything that lay within the compass of human possibility, and when she entered life, beautiful, accomplished, and an heiress, she had, of course, all the eligibles and non-eligibles of the other sex sighing at her feet, and she had no doubt that Augustine was a most fortunate man in having obtained her. It is a great mistake to suppose that a woman with no heart will be an easy creditor in the exchange of affection. There is not on earth a more merciless exactor of love from others than a thoroughly selfish woman, and the more unlovely she grows, the more jealously and scrupulously she exacts love, to the uttermost farthing. When, therefore, St. Clair began to drop off those gallantries and small attentions which flowed at first through the habitude of courtship, he found his sultana no way ready to resign her slave. There were abundance of tears, poutings, and small tempests. There were discontents, pinings, upbraidings. St. Clair was good-natured and self-indulgent, and sought to buy off with presents and flatteries, and when Marie became mother to a beautiful daughter, he really felt awakened, for a time, to something like tenderness. St. Clair's mother had been a woman of uncommon elevation and purity of character, and he gave to his child his mother's name, fondly fancying that she would prove a reproduction of her image. The thing had been remarked with petulant jealousy by his wife, and she regarded her husband's absorbing devotion to the child with suspicion and dislike. All that was given to her seemed so much taken from herself. From the time of the birth of this child her health gradually sunk. A life of constant inaction, bodily and mental, the friction of ceaseless ennui and discontent, united to the ordinary weakness which attended the period of maternity, in course of a few years changed the blooming young belle into a yellow, faded, sickly woman, whose time was divided among a variety of fanciful diseases, and who considered herself, in every sense, the most ill-used and suffering person in existence. There was no end of her various complaints, but her principal forte appeared to lie in sick headache, which sometimes would confine her to her room 3 days out of 6. As of course all family arrangements fell into the hands of servants, St. Clair found his menage anything but comfortable. His only daughter was exceedingly delicate, and he feared that, with no one to look after her and attend to her, her health and life might yet fall a sacrifice to her mother's inefficiency. He had taken her with him on a tour to Vermont, and had persuaded his cousin, Miss Ophelia St. Clair, to return with him to his Southern residence, and they are now returning on this boat, where we have introduced them to our readers. And now, while the distant domes and spires of New Orleans rise to our view, there is yet time for an introduction to Miss Ophelia. Whoever has traveled in the New England States will remember, in some cool village, the large farmhouse, with its clean-swept grassy yard, shaded by the dense and massive foliage of the sugar maple, and remember the air of order and stillness, of perpetuity and unchanging repose, that seemed to breathe over the whole place. Nothing lost or out of order, not a picket loose in the fence, not a particle of litter in the turfy yard, with its clumps of lilac bushes growing up under the windows. Within, he will remember wide, clean rooms, where nothing ever seems to be doing or going to be done, where everything is once and forever rigidly in place, and where all household arrangements move with the punctual exactness of the old clock in the corner. In the family keeping-room, as it is termed, he will remember the staid, respectable old bookcase with its glass doors, where Rollin's History, Milton's Paradise Lost, Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, and Scott's Family Bible stand side by side in decorous order, with multitudes of other books equally solemn and respectable. Notes: Rollin's History, The Ancient History, 10 volumes, 1730 to 1738, by the French historian Charles Rollin, 1661 to 1741. Scott's Family Bible, 1788 1792, edited with notes by the English biblical commentator Thomas Scott, 1747 1821. There are no servants in the house but the lady in the snowy cap with the spectacles, who sits sewing every afternoon among her daughters, as if nothing ever had been done or were to be done. She and her girls, in some long-forgotten fore-part of the day, did up the work, and for the rest of the time, probably, at all hours when you would see them, it is done up. The old kitchen floor never seems stained or spotted. The tables, the chairs, and the various cooking utensils never seem deranged or disordered. Though 3 and sometimes 4 meals a day are got there, though the family washing and ironing is there performed, and though pounds of butter and cheese are in some silent and mysterious manner there brought into existence. On such a farm, in such a house and family, Miss Ophelia had spent a quiet existence of some 45 years, when her cousin invited her to visit his southern mansion. The eldest of a large family, she was still considered by her father and mother as one of the children, and the proposal that she should go to Orleans was a most momentous one to the family circle. The old gray-headed father took down Morse's atlas out of the bookcase and looked out the exact latitude and longitude, and read Flint's Travels in the South and West, to make up his own mind as to the nature of the country. Notes. The Serographic Atlas of the United States, 1842 to 1845, by Sidney Edwards Morse, 1794 to 1871, son of the geographer Jedediah Morse, and brother of the painter-inventor Samuel F. B. Morse. Note. Recollections of the Last 10 Years, 1826, by Timothy Flint, 1780 to 1840, missionary of Presbyterianism to the Trans-Allegheny West. The good mother inquired anxiously if Orleans wasn't an awful wicked place, saying that it seemed to her most equal to going on the Sandwich Islands or anywhere among the heathen. It was known at the minister's and at the doctor's, and at Miss Peabody's milliner's shop, that Ophelia St. Clair was talking about going away down to Orleans with her cousin, and of course the whole village could do no less than help this very important process of taking about the matter. The minister, who inclined strongly to abolitionist views, was quite doubtful whether such a step might not tend somewhat to encourage the Southerners in holding on to their slaves, while the doctor, who was a staunch colonizationist, inclined to the opinion that Miss Ophelia ought to go, to show the Orleans people that we don't think hardly of them, after all. He was of opinion, in fact, that Southern people needed encouraging. When, however, the fact that she had resolved to go was fully before the public mind, she was solemnly invited out to tea by all her friends and neighbors for the space of a fortnight, and her prospects and plans duly canvassed and inquired into. Miss Moseley, who came into the house to help to do the dressmaking, acquired daily accessions of importance from the developments with regard to Miss Ophelia's wardrobe which she had been enabled to make. It was credibly ascertained that Squire Sinclair, as his name was commonly contracted in the neighborhood, had counted out $50 and given them to Miss Ophelia, and told her to buy any clothes she thought best, and that 2 new silk dresses and a bonnet had been sent for from Boston. As to the propriety of this extraordinary outlay, the public mind was divided, some affirming that it was well enough, all things considered, for once in one's life, and others stoutly affirming that the money had better have been sent to the missionaries. But all parties agreed that there had been no such parasol seen in those parts as had been sent on from New York, and that she had one silk dress that might fairly be trusted to stand alone, whatever might be said of its mistress. There were credible rumors, also, of a hem-stitched pocket-handkerchief, and report even went so far as to state that Miss Ophelia had one pocket-handkerchief with lace all around it. It was even added that it was worked in the corners. But this latter point was never satisfactorily ascertained, and remains, in fact, unsettled to this day. Miss Ophelia, as you now behold her, stands before you in a very shining brown linen traveling dress, tall, square-formed, and angular. Her face was thin and rather sharp in its outlines, the lips compressed, like those of a person who is in the habit of making up her mind definitely on all subjects, while the keen dark eyes had a peculiarly searching, advised movement, and traveled over everything as if they were looking for something to take care of. All her movements were sharp, decided, and energetic, and though she was never much of a talker, her words were remarkably direct and to the purpose when she did speak. In her habits she was a living impersonation of order, method, and exactness. In punctuality she was as inevitable as a clock, and as inexorable as a railroad engine, and she held in most decided contempt and abomination anything of a contrary character. The great sin of sins, in her eyes, the sum of all evils, was expressed by one very common and important word in her vocabulary: shiftlessness.
Her finale, an ultimatum of contempt, consisted in a very emphatic pronunciation of the word "shiftless," and by this she characterized all modes of procedure which had not a direct and inevitable relation to accomplishment of some purpose then definitely had in mind. People who did nothing, or who did not know exactly what they were going to do, or who did not take the most direct way to accomplish what they set their hands to, were objects of her entire contempt, a contempt shown less frequently by anything she said than by a kind of stony grimness, as if she scorned to say anything about the matter. As to mental cultivation, she had a clear, strong, active mind, was well and thoroughly read in history and the older English classics, and thought with great strength within certain narrow limits. Her theological tenets were all made up, labeled in most positive and distinct forms, and put by, like the bundles in her patched trunk. There were just so many of them, and there were never to be any more. So also were her ideas with regard to most matters of practical life, such as housekeeping in all its branches, and the various political relations of her native village. And, underlying all, deeper than anything else, higher and broader, lay the strongest principle of her being, conscientiousness. Nowhere is conscience so dominant and all-absorbing as with New England women. It is the granite formation which lies deepest and rises out even to the tops of the highest mountains. Miss Ophelia was the absolute bond-slave of the "ought." Once make her certain that the path of duty, as she commonly phrased it, lay in any given direction, and fire and water could not keep her from it. She would walk straight down into a well, or up to a loaded cannon's mouth, if she were only quite sure that there the path lay. Her standard of right was so high, so all-embracing, so minute, and making so few concessions to human frailty, that, though she strove with heroic ardor to reach it, she never actually did so, and of course was burdened with a constant and often harassing sense of deficiency. This gave a severe and somewhat gloomy cast to her religious character. But how in the world can Miss Ophelia get along with Augustine St. Clair? Gay, easy, unpunctual, unpractical, skeptical, in short, walking with impudent and nonchalant freedom over every one of her most cherished habits and opinions. To tell the truth, then, Miss Ophelia loved him. When a boy, it had been hers to teach him his catechism, mend his clothes, comb his hair, and bring him up generally in the way he should go. And her heart having a warm side to it, Augustine had, as he usually did with most people, monopolized a large share of it for himself, and therefore it was that he succeeded very easily in persuading her that the path of duty lay in the direction of New Orleans, and that she must go with him to take care of Eva, and keep everything from going to wreck and ruin during the frequent illnesses of his wife. The idea of a house without anybody to take care of it went to her heart. Then she loved the lovely little girl as few could help doing, and though she regarded Augustine as very much of a heathen, yet she loved him, laughed at his jokes, and forbore with his failings, to an extent which those who knew him thought perfectly incredible. But what more or other is to be known of Miss Ophelia our reader must discover by a personal acquaintance. There she is, sitting now in her stateroom, surrounded by a mixed multitude of little and big carpet-bags, boxes, baskets, each containing some separate responsibility which she is tying, binding up, packing, or fastening, with a face of great earnestness.
"Now, Eva, have you kept count of your things? Of course you haven't. Children never do. There's the spotted carpet-bag and the little blue bandbox with your best bonnet. That's 2. Then the india-rubber satchel is 3, and my tape and needle-box is 4, and my bandbox 5, and my collar-box and that little hair-trunk 7. What have you done with your sunshade? Give it to me, and let me put a paper round it, and tie it to my umbrella with my shade. There, now."
"Why, Auntie, we are only going up home. What is the use?"
"To keep it nice, child, people must take care of their things, if they ever mean to have anything. And now, Eva, is your thimble put up?"
"Really, Auntie, I don't know."
"Well, never mind. I'll look your box over. Thimble, wax, 2 spools, scissors, knife, tape needle. All right, put it in here. What did you ever do, child, when you were coming on with only your papa? I should have thought you'd have lost everything you had."
"Well, Auntie, I did lose a great many,
And then, when we stopped anywhere, papa would buy some more of whatever it was. Mercy on us, child, what a way!" "It was a very easy way, auntie," said Eva. "It's a dreadful shiftless one," said auntie. "Why, auntie, what'll you do now?" said Eva. "That trunk is too full to be shut down." "It must shut down," said auntie, with the air of a general, as she squeezed the things in and sprung upon the lid. Still a little gap remained about the mouth of the trunk. "Get up here, Eva," said Miss Ophelia, courageously. "What has been done can be done again. This trunk has got to be shut and locked. There are no two ways about it." And the trunk, intimidated, doubtless, by this resolute statement, gave in. The hasp snapped sharply in its hole, and Miss Ophelia turned the key and pocketed it in triumph. "Now we're ready. Where's your papa? I think it time this baggage was set out. Do look out, Eva, and see if you see your papa." "Oh, yes, he's down the other end of the gentleman's cabin, eating an orange." "He can't know how near we are coming," said auntie. "Hadn't you better run and speak to him?" "Papa never is in a hurry about anything," said Eva, "and we haven't come to the landing. Do step on the guards, auntie. Look, there's our house, up that street." The boat now began, with heavy groans, like some vast tired monster, to prepare to push up among the multiplied steamers at the levee. Eva joyously pointed out the various spires, domes, and waymarks by which she recognized her native city. "Yes, yes, dear, very fine," said Miss Ophelia. "But mercy on us, the boat has stopped. Where is your father?" And now ensued the usual turmoil of landing, waiters running 20 ways at once, men tugging trunks, carpet-bags, boxes, women anxiously calling to their children, and everybody crowding in a dense mass to the plank towards the landing. Miss Ophelia seated herself resolutely on the lately vanquished trunk, and marshalling all her goods and chattels in fine military order, seemed resolved to defend them to the last.
"Shall I take your trunk, ma'am?"
"Shall I take your baggage?"
"Let me tend to your baggage, missus."
"Shan't I carry out these yere, missus?" rained down upon her unheeded. She sat with grim determination, upright as a darning needle stuck in a board, holding on her bundle of umbrella and parasols, and replying with a determination that was enough to strike dismay even into a hackman, wondering to Eva, in each interval, what upon earth her papa could be thinking of. He couldn't have fallen over now, but something must have happened. And just as she had begun to work herself into a real distress, he came up, with his usually careless motion, and giving Eva a quarter of the orange he was eating, said,
"Well, Cousin Vermont, I suppose you are all ready."
"I've been ready, waiting, nearly an hour," said Miss Ophelia. "I began to be really concerned about you."
"That's a clever fellow, now," said he. "Well, the carriage is waiting, and the crowd are now off, so that one can walk out in a decent and Christian manner, and not be pushed and shoved. Here," he added to a driver who stood behind him, "take these things."
"I'll go and see to his putting them in," said Miss Ophelia.
"Oh, pshaw, cousin, what's the use?" said St. Clair.
"Well, at any rate, I'll carry this, and this, and this," said Miss Ophelia, singling out 3 boxes and a small carpet-bag.
My dear Miss Vermont, positively you mustn't come the Green Mountains over us that way.
You must adopt at least a piece of a Southern principle, and not walk out under all that load. They'll take you for a waiting-maid. Give them to this fellow. He'll put them down as if they were eggs, now." Miss Ophelia looked despairingly as her cousin took all her treasures from her, and rejoiced to find herself once more in the carriage with them in a state of preservation.
"Where's Tom?"
said Eva. "Oh, he's on the outside, pussy. I'm going to take Tom up to mother for a peace offering, to make up for that drunken fellow that upset the carriage."
"Oh, Tom will make a splendid driver, I know," said Eva. "He'll never get drunk."
The carriage stopped in front of an ancient mansion, built in that odd mixture of Spanish and French style of which there are specimens in some parts of New Orleans. It was built in the Moorish fashion, a square building enclosing a courtyard, into which the carriage drove through an arched gateway. The court, in the inside, had evidently been arranged to gratify a picturesque and voluptuous ideality. Wide galleries ran all around the 4 sides, whose Moorish arches, slender pillars, and arabesque ornaments carried the mind back, as in a dream, to the reign of Oriental romance in Spain.
In the middle of the court a fountain threw high its silvery water, falling in a never-ceasing spray into a marble basin fringed with a deep border of fragrant violets. The water in the fountain, pellucid as crystal, was alive with myriads of gold and silver fishes, twinkling and darting through it like so many living jewels. Around the fountain ran a walk, paved with a mosaic of pebbles, laid in various fanciful patterns, and this, again, was surrounded by turf, smooth as green velvet, while a carriage drive enclosed the whole. Two large orange trees, now fragrant with blossoms, threw a delicious shade, and, ranged in a circle round upon the turf, were marble vases of arabesque sculpture, containing the choicest flowering plants of the tropics. Huge pomegranate trees, with their glossy leaves and flame-colored flowers, dark-leaved Arabian jasmines, with their silvery stars, geraniums, luxuriant roses, bending beneath their heavy abundance of flowers, golden jessamines, lemon-scented verbenum, all united their bloom and fragrance, while here and there a mystic old aloe, with its strange massive leaves, sat looking like some old enchanter, sitting in weird grandeur among the more perishable bloom and fragrance around it. The galleries that surrounded the court were festooned with a curtain of some kind of Moorish stuff, and could be drawn down at pleasure to exclude the beams of the sun. On the whole, the appearance of the place was luxurious and romantic. As the carriage drove in, Eva seemed like a bird ready to burst from a cage with the wild eagerness of her delight.
"Oh, isn't it beautiful, lovely, my own dear darling home," she said to Miss Ophelia. "Isn't it beautiful?" "'Tis a pretty place," said Ophelia, as she alighted, "though it looks rather old and heathenish to me." Tom got down from the carriage and looked about with an air of calm, still enjoyment. The negro, it must be remembered, is an exotic of the most gorgeous and superb countries of the world, and he has, deep in his heart, a passion for all that is splendid, rich, and fanciful. A passion which, rudely indulged by an untrained taste, draws on them the ridicule of the colder and more correct white race. St. Clair, who was in heart a poetical voluptuary, smiled as Miss Ophelia made her remark on his premises, and, turning to Tom, who was standing looking around, his beaming black face perfectly radiant with admiration, he said, "Tom, my boy, this seems to suit you."
"Yes, massa, it looks about the right thing," said Tom.
All this passed in a moment, while trunks were being hustled off, hackmen paid, and while a crowd of all ages and sizes, men, women, and children, came running through the galleries, both above and below, to see Massa come in. Foremost among them was a highly dressed young mulatto man, evidently a very distingué personage, attired in the ultra extreme of the mode, and gracefully waving a scented cambric handkerchief in his hand. This personage had been exerting himself, with great alacrity, in driving all the flock of domestics to the other end of the veranda.
"Back, all of you! I am ashamed of you," he said, in a tone of authority. "Would you intrude on master's domestic relations in the first hour of his return?"
All looked abashed at this elegant speech, delivered with quite an air, and stood huddled together at a respectful distance, except two stout porters, who came up and began conveying away the baggage. Owing to Mr. Adolph's systematic arrangements, when St. Clair turned round from paying the hackman, there was nobody in view but Mr. Adolph himself, conspicuous in satin vest, gold guard chain, and white pants, and bowing with inexpressible grace and suavity.
"Ah, Adolph, it is you," said his master, offering his hand to him. "How are you, boy?"
While Adolph poured forth with great fluency an extemporary speech which he had been preparing with great care for a fortnight before.
"Well, well," said St. Clair, passing on, with his usual air of negligent drollery, "that's very well got up, Adolph. See that the baggage is well bestowed. I'll come to the people in a minute." And, so saying, he led Miss Ophelia to a large parlor that opened on the veranda. While this had been passing, Eva had flown like a bird through the porch and parlor to a little boudoir opening likewise on the veranda. A tall, dark-eyed, sallow woman half rose from a couch on which she was reclining.
"Mamma,"
said Eva, in a sort of a rapture, throwing herself on her neck and embracing her over and over again.
"that'll do. Take care, child. Don't. You make my head ache,"
said the mother, after she had languidly kissed her.
St. Clair came in, embraced his wife in true orthodox husbandly fashion, and then presented to her his cousin. Marie lifted her large eyes on her cousin with an air of some curiosity, and received her with languid politeness. A crowd of servants now pressed to the entry door, and among them a middle-aged mulatto woman, of very respectable appearance, stood foremost, in a tremor of expectation and joy, at the door. "Oh, there's Mammy," said Eva, as she flew across the room, and throwing herself into her arms, she kissed her repeatedly. This woman did not tell her that she made her head ache, but on the contrary, she hugged her, and laughed, and cried, till her sanity was a thing to be doubted of, and when released from her, Eva flew from one to another, shaking hands and kissing, in a way that Miss Ophelia afterwards declared fairly turned her stomach. "Well," said Miss Ophelia, "you Southern children can do something that I couldn't." "What now, pray?" said St. Clair. "Well, I want to be kind to everybody, and I wouldn't have anything hurt, but as to kissing—" "Niggers," said St. Clair. "That you're not up to, hey?" "Yes, that's it. How can she?" St. Clair laughed as he went into the passage. "Hello, here! What's to pay out here? Here, you all, Mammy, Jimmy, Polly, Suky, glad to see massa," he said as he went shaking hands from one to another. "Look out for the babies," he added, as he stumbled over a sooty little urchin, who was crawling upon all fours. "If I step upon anybody, let 'em mention it." There was an abundance of laughing and blessing massa as St. Clair distributed small pieces of change among them. "Come, now, take yourselves off, like good boys and girls," he said, and the whole assemblage, dark and light, disappeared through a door into a large veranda, followed by Eva, who carried a large satchel, which she had been filling with apples, nuts, candy, ribbons, laces, and toys of every description, during her whole homeward journey. As St. Clair turned to go back, his eye fell upon Tom, who was standing uneasily, shifting from one foot to the other, while Adolphe stood negligently leaning against the banisters, examining Tom through an opera-glass, with an air that would have done credit to any dandy living. "Puh, you puppy," said his master, striking down the opera-glass. "Is that the way you treat your company? Seems to me, Dolph," he added, laying his finger on the elegant figured satin vest that Adolphe was sporting, "seems to me that's my vest." "Oh, massa, this vest all stained with wine. Of course, a gentleman in master's standing never wears a vest like this. I understood I was to take it. It does for a poor nigger fellow like me." And Adolphe tossed his head and passed his fingers through his scented hair with a grace. "So that's it, is it?" said St. Clair carelessly. "Well, here, I'm going to show this Tom to his mistress, and then you take him to the kitchen, and mind you don't put on any of your airs to him. He's worth 2 such puppies as you." "Master always will have his joke," said Adolphe, laughing. "I'm delighted to see master in such spirits." "Here, Tom," said St. Clair, beckoning. Tom entered the room. He looked wistfully on the velvet carpets, and the before unimagined splendors of mirrors, pictures, statues, and curtains, and, like the Queen of Sheba before Solomon, there was no more spirit in him. He looked afraid even to set his feet down. "See here, Marie," said St. Clair to his wife, "I've brought you a coachman, at last, to order. I tell you he's a regular hearse for blackness and sobriety, and will drive you like a funeral if you want. Open your eyes, now, and look at him. Now, don't say I never think about you when I'm gone." Marie opened her eyes and fixed them on Tom without rising. "I know he'll get drunk," she said. "No, he's warranted a pious and sober article." "Well, I hope he may turn out well," said the lady. "It's more than I expect, though." "Dolph," said St. Clair, "show Tom downstairs. And mind yourself," he added. "Remember what I told you." Adolphe tripped gracefully forward, and Tom, with lumbering tread, went after. "He's a perfect behemoth," said Marie. "Come now, Marie," said St. Clair, seating himself on a stool beside her sofa, "be gracious, and say something pretty to a fellow." "You've been gone a fortnight beyond the time," said the lady, pouting. "Well, you know I wrote you the reason." "Such a short, cold letter," said the lady. "Dear me, the mail was just going, and it had to be that or nothing." "That's just the way, always," said the lady. "Always something to make your journeys long and letters short." "See here, now," he added, drawing an elegant velvet case out of his pocket and opening it. Here's a present I got for you in New York." It was a daguerreotype, clear and soft as an engraving, representing Eva and her father sitting hand in hand. Marie looked at it with a dissatisfied air. "What made you sit in such an awkward position?" she said. "Well, the position may be a matter of opinion, but what do you think of the likeness?" "If you don't think anything of my opinion in one case, I suppose you wouldn't in another," said the lady, shutting the daguerreotype. "Hang the woman," said St. Clair mentally, but aloud he added, "Come now, Marie, what do you think of the likeness? Don't be nonsensical now." "It's very inconsiderate of you, St. Clair," said the lady, "to insist on my talking and looking at things. You know I've been lying all day with a sick headache, and there's been such a tumult made ever since you came, I'm half dead." "You're subject to the sick headache, ma'am?" said Miss Ophelia, suddenly rising from the depths of the large arm-chair where she had sat quietly, taking an inventory of the furniture and calculating its expense. "Yes, I'm a perfect martyr to it," said the lady. "Juniper berry tea is good for sick headache," said Miss Ophelia. "At least, August, Dean Abraham Perry's wife, used to say so, and she was a great nurse." "I'll have the first juniper berries that get ripe in our garden by the lake brought in for that special purpose," said St. Clair, gravely pulling the bell as he did so. "Meanwhile, cousin, you must be wanting to retire to your apartment and refresh yourself a little after your journey. Dolph," he added, "tell mammy to come here." The decent mulatto woman whom Eva had caressed so rapturously soon entered. She was dressed neatly, with a high red and yellow turban on her head, the recent gift of Eva, and which the child had been arranging on her head. "Mammy," said St. Clair, "I put this lady under your care. She is tired and wants rest. Take her to her chamber, and be sure she is made comfortable." And Miss Ophelia disappeared in the rear of mammy. End of chapter 15.